So in 274, he reiterates kind of the power struggle going on in the university. So he says, it was at first argued that these were works of high literary quality that had been unfairly excluded from the traditional canons of literature. So he's saying like works from women or works from African Americans or Latino, etc. At first, it was argued that they should be included in the literary canon just because it says they were unfairly excluded. Maybe they were of high quality. And so he says the traditional canon of literature is Homer, Shakespeare, and Goethe. And then I'll keep quoting. In the interest of maintaining the authority of white European males, so this is the Homer, Shakespeare, and Goethe. This was a way of keeping them to be the highest and not excluding everybody else. So we shouldn't do that, was the initial argument. In time, however, the aesthetic argument was largely dropped, and it was simply said that literature had always been not an aesthetic, but a political construct. One way to assert through art the dominance of the masculine power structure. To give the neglected writings of popular culture, or of women, or of African Americans, or various third world writers, the status of literature by teaching them in university was not only to bring their virtues to the attention of the world, but to seize, the language is always militant, their rightful place in the power structure for the peoples they represented. So you see how kind of the approach to literature is different. Rather than looking at the best aesthetic, the best how they wrote and how the poeticness and the meanings, and rather than just being very good writers, very good capturers of human emotion and ideas, which was the traditional canon, the Shakespeare, the Homer, the Goethe. Now what counts as good literature is actually historical struggles of oppression, or of oppression, not even of power, because then you could still, if that was your framework, then you could still include Shakespeare and just say that he was a powerful white male or something like that, or very British, or I don't know. But it's not about even the strong; it's about the weak. It's about literature as writers who write about their oppression. And those are the people that should be studied. Why? Why? Because other students need to study other people's oppression? Because why? So again, you get into this kind of strange, murky field. And I wonder whether this new purpose for literature is something that is seen as kind of a social engineering. Like, what's its purpose? Is it social engineering? And why? Compare that to the original purpose of Shakespeare. We study Shakespeare because he discusses the human condition, and he writes it, and his plays are designed very well to illustrate it. And a lot of the nuance in some of the ideas, the irony of some of it, like the irony of Hamlet's soliloquies and his stuff like that. But now we have what? We have kind of Nietzsche's will to power that we are all supposed to study. And even better if we study people that don't look like us or have different life experiences. But again, why? Why is that studied? Why would we want to study the narrow experiences of the oppression of one person when we can study the creative works? So Shakespeare didn't necessarily suffer. Shakespeare had the leisure to write eloquently, creatively. But we don't want that fantasy. In the modern university, we want actual blood on the page, right? We want people that write, not with ink, but their own blood. We want people who write from their suffering as a way to scare students into trauma, historical trauma, and make them better people that way. They won't be better writers, but they will have some knowledge and perhaps some resentment about historical events or things that we may wish never happened. So in any case, you see how the purposes or the approaches are very different. And if that becomes the case, then everybody's experience, and this is just, now we're just about like, we're all in a circle and we're doing grief counseling, right? And there's no counselor. If it's all now just about people's experiences, then anybody's experience is valuable if they have some trauma, I guess, and especially if they're in an oppressed minority group. And so here's this little piece here on page 277, and he's quoting someone, Janet Malcolm. I don't know who Janet Malcolm is, it doesn't really matter, but Janet Malcolm says that American higher education is in the democratizing discussion class. Here, any idiotic thing the student says is listened to as if it was brilliant, and here our national vice of talking for the sake of hearing ourselves talk is cultivated as if it was a virtue. A good teacher is someone who can somehow transform this discouraging gathering of babblers into an inspiring community of minds working together. So now, and I've experienced a bit of this myself in my courses, when you're opening it up to bowl sessions, as it's called, you're getting opinions, but what's the point of meeting and having a class to discuss opinions that you already have? Wouldn't it, unless this is all about social engineering, right? Wouldn't it be better to discuss the works? Because we're interested in studying. There's no class, or there may be, but they're not supposed to be classes in what I think now. Can you imagine? Courses are always in a topic that usually you don't know much about before you go. Why would we care to hear about what you think now? Wouldn't it be better for you to discuss the readings? But you don't get a lot of that, probably first of all, because not a lot of people do the readings in the first place, right? But it becomes, I guess, again, I'm trying to illustrate how the view of education has changed. If you can come into a classroom and allowed to speak your particular narrowed experience and often nonsensical because you haven't done the readings, why should that be empowered? Because it is today. There's a student power movement kind of going on. Why is that important? It's not a class about you, and it's not a class about what you think now. It's supposed to be of you out of your comfort zone and you trying to come to grips and understand something else, not yourself. That's supposed to be the purpose of studying these things. But rather, we are coached, especially by our managers, that we're supposed to cater to student sensibilities, and we're supposed to start from their shoes and their position, and we're supposed to give students a voice. But do student voices, are they more important than the curriculum and more important than the topics to be studied? No student anymore is humbled by the works they study. They are now, it's almost not even a point of having a teacher in the room anymore or an instructor in the room, because students are given such high credence. But ultimately, the courses are supposed to be about not you, but the material.